Shalom and welcome to the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're continuing our work in Jeremiah chapter 6, looking today at verse 12. In verse 11, we saw Jeremiah protesting that he was so weary, so tired of holding in this wrath of the Lord. He loves his people. He doesn't want to have to announce it and pour it out, so to speak, but God tells him it's going to be poured out anyway, and it's going to affect the entire population from the youngest, the very youngest, to the very eldest. We're going to continue the same thought as the Lord continues his word here in verse 12. So let's read the text in Hebrew as we get started. V'nasabu vatehem la'acharim sadot v'nashim yakdav ki ate et yadi al yoshevei ha'aretz ne'um Adonai. So we start with V'nasabu. Well, what do we have here? We have a vav. This is actually going to be attached to a perfect verb. So this is going to be a perfect. It's going to be a better perfect consecutive. So it's sort of throwing it back into the future. There was an imperfect before this, and at the end of toward the end of verse 11, and so this is going back into the future. And well, what do we have? Nasab, is that the verb here? Looks like a pretty typical. Well, no, not exactly. The verb we have here is one you probably know, savav, which means in the cow with the two baits like that, which is why you see the dagish forte and the strong dagish in the bait right there, which means to turn and to go around. Well, what do we have at the beginning? Well, we have a nun prefix, so this is a third common plural, but this is a nifal. And in the nifal, which is not the usual conjugation for this verb, it means not so much to go around something, but to be turned over. You can see this idea of flipping or changing the circumstances. So they will be turned over. And what will be turned over? Batehem. Well, this is the plural. Batim is the plural of bayit, word we know, which means house. So it becomes batim, and then we add a pronoun suffix here with the third common plural, third masculine plural suffix on it here. So their houses will be turned over. Because this is, again, this perfect consecutive throws it into the future. Their houses will be turned over to others, acherim. So it's just the plural of acher, meaning others. Sadot, this is the plural of sadeh, which is a field. Looks like a feminine plural, even though it's a masculine noun. There's some words that do that. Fields and women, nashim, that's the plural of isha, irregular plural, so it looks like a masculine, even though it's actually a feminine. This probably means wives. Fields and women, or fields and wives together, word that we saw from verse 11 as well. So everything is going to be turned over to others, meaning to the enemy soldiers as they come in. Nothing is going to be left. For, usually translated for, sometimes it can have a temporal sense, and you're going to see one of our translations is going to pick up maybe the idea of when. For, we can keep for, though, even if we understand it in a slightly temporal sense. You'll see that. Now, here's our one tricky word in this verse. Well, this one was a little bit tricky, too, but ate. Well, what do we have here? We have an aleph at the beginning, so this is going to be an imperfect. It's going to be an imperfect. It's going to be a first common singular. But if that's the prefix of the imperfect and the hey at the end, well, what do we have? Well, this is actually from the verb nata, which is one of two, well, there's several words, but one of two common verbs that loses the nun at the beginning and sometimes loses the hey at the end. It didn't here, but sometimes it does, and you're left with just one letter in the middle. The other one is naka, to strike. But here we see this tate in the middle. So this is going to be a hifil here with the mainly because of the pathak that you find underneath the prefix, the performative here. And then the nun of the verb itself is assimilated into this dagish here in the tate, and then the hey at the end. So, and the verb means usually to stretch out. It can mean that in the cal, but it has a stronger sense in the hifil as well. For I will stretch out, and what does the Lord usually stretch out? Well, it's usually stretching out, here's your direct object marker, my hand. So yad with the first common singular suffix. I will stretch out my hand in the sense of strength here, or in this particular context, the context of judgment, especially followed with the preposition al. So upon or against the inhabitants. So here you see this yod, right, this holum right here with the yod. So what we have here, this is a participle. It's going to be a masculine plural participle, kal, from the verb yashav, meaning to dwell or to sit. So this is a construct state here. It would usually be yoshavim, but here it's the dwellers of the land. And it's the dwellers because it's in construct with the land. So the article carries its force all the way over here, and so this is determined as well. So the dwellers of the land, says the Lord, or an oracle of Yahweh. So the Lord is going to stretch out his hand against all who dwell in the land. So it's not very complicated in terms of our analysis, going through the verse here. Let's hide our work and look at 3 translations just very, very quickly. Most of the, actually, 1 translation and 2 paraphrases. Let's take the NIV as a fairly typical translation. You're going to see very little variation in most of the major translations. Their houses will be turned over to others, together with, over here, their fields and their wives. Now, you don't have their in this case here, but it is certainly carried over from the idea of their houses, so it's proper to imply that for the 2 others as well. When, now they've taken this more of a temporal sense, you could just keep it as for, but it also does imply that when is this going to happen? So that's an interpretive call there, but it's not a bad interpretation. When I stretch out, I extend my hand against those who live, the inhabitants of the land, in the land, declares the Lord. So that's a pretty straightforward translation, and almost all of our translations will go that way. Found a couple paraphrases. First, in the New Living translation, which is again a paraphrase, their homes will be turned over to their enemies. Now the word here is just others, but in the context that is correct, as will their fields and their wives. For I will extend or stretch out my hand, but they translate my powerful fist. Well, that's getting this idea of a coming judgment. So that's an interpretation here, but it's probably an accurate interpretation. So as a paraphrase, I think it does justice against the people of this land. It's just the land, but it's obviously this land, says the Lord. And then just one more, the Living Bible. This is the New Living Translation, the older Living Bible. Their enemies shall live in their homes. They've actually flipped this around and made the enemies the subject rather than taking it as a passive. Their homes will be turned over. Their enemies shall live in their homes. So the others, you can see how they get that here, shall actually will be turned over. So shall live in their homes, because that's what's going to take place. You don't have the verb live, but you do have this idea. So as a paraphrase, it's accurate. This is what's going to happen here. And take their fields and wives. So again, this verb is added, but it is developing the proper idea as a paraphrase. For I will punish the people of this land, stretch out my hand, to give the idea of punish, the Lord has said. The rest of it is accurate. The Lord's judgment is coming against his people. He knows what he's doing. He knows why he's doing it. His punishment is always well thought through and well merited, properly proportioned to his people. Always important to listen to what he says to us. Well, we have more to say as we continue working through Jeremiah chapter 6, so check back with us soon for our next weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. Shalom.